right, you're listening to Hawke Talk. I'm here today with Dave Asprey. How are you?
I'm doing really well, Eric.
Awesome. Great to hear. So, to take it all the way back, I assume like the day you're born, you're in a hospital and you came out and said, "This is the last day I will ever spend in a hospital. I will never be back here. I'm going to live forever. I'm going to be the healthiest person on the planet. I'm out." Is that a fair assessment? And that was it?
Not even a little bit.
So, take me back. Where are you from originally?
I was born in New Mexico.
Okay. And early days, like what were you interested in? Like, I assume it wasn't always,
Well,
human performance
it,
longevity. Like, tell me about your childhood a
it,
little bit.
I had the cord wrapped around my neck when I was born.
Oh,
So I came out into the world literally believing that something was trying to kill me.
yeah.
And then, as hospitals do, they immediately whisked me off to some kind of, aloneness chamber.
Yep.
And as I went through my path of becoming a leader and just working on my own shit, it turns out that gave me PTSD.
Yep.
And I was able to actually remember the emotional state of being born. And it turns out there's a lot of really good science that affects personality
Hmm.
until you do something about it. So I had just unexplained anger. And what I now would say was probably like anxiety, but at the time I didn't recognize it as that. But it was just always present because it was there from the very start. And so it turns out the conditions in the womb, and especially around birth, affect you more than you think.
Yep.
You're like, but I don't remember it, therefore it doesn't matter. But yeah, your body doesn't care if you remember it because your body knows how to breathe,
Yep.
even if you're not paying attention, and it knows how to digest without any input from you. So this is like a protection response that actually formed a lot of the way I focused on business, even in the early parts of my career. So it turns out it wasn't so straightforward. It also affects health. People who have a traumatic birth experience oftentimes have more autoimmune issues and just more general health issues.
Yep.
I wouldn't say that was the only thing that affected my health, but it was surprisingly important when I really got down to
Well, it
what was
makes
going on.
sense. I mean, now that I'm a dad and I see, the development of my daughter, like those little or major early things are what dictate your personality. Let's just, people talk about this with like, you don't remember what happened when you were one or whatever. And it's like, sure, you might not have a conscious memory of an experience at one, but that experience dictates how you react the next week when you remember it that next week, which then dictates how you react the next week, and it compounds. So it ends up being this
Yeah.
thing that you feed off of to that next experience. So if your first experience is having, as you said, something that you think is trying to kill you and then whisked off to be in isolation, until that cycle's broken, you're going to have that trauma, which I think it's overused, but you're going to have it.
It's a trauma, and it's one of those things where I remember when I was 30, I started working on that without knowing that it had anything to do with my state of unhappiness.
Yeah.
Even though I'd been very successful by a lot of measures, I remember saying, "But I don't remember any of that." And then I did this really light, just breathe deep and go back, and all of a sudden I remember details, and I called my parents and said, "Did this happen?" Like, "Oh yeah, that happened." Whoa!
Wow.
And then I went really deep in the science on that, and it turns out now for 11 years I've been running a neuroscience company called 40 Years of Zen. I've had 1,500 entrepreneurs and CEOs and executive types come through the program. It's 5 days with electrodes glued to your head to see what's going on in there and reprogram it. And when you're done, you're in the state of someone who's meditated daily for decades.
Uh-huh.
And the process of doing that has just told me how much of what we think we are choosing to do is automated protection mechanisms in your operating system in your body. You don't know it.
Yep.
I remember one friend, Craig, who went through the program. He runs a 1,200 person company.
Mm-hmm.
And he came out and said, "I just realized that all of my success was because of bullies in 7th grade, right? Just trying to prove you're good enough and all that." And so many highly successful people are doing it out of some desire to prove something
Yep.
to others.
Yep.
And in my early career, it was like, if I have money, then I'll be safe. I didn't think that, but that was the underlying thing. Right. And actually, I'll be safe and I'll be happy. I wouldn't have even known that wasn't feeling safe. I mean, I would have to not be safe. There's no reason to be afraid. But one of the learnings I had was that fear is an emotion. It doesn't have to have a reason. It just happens.
Yep.
So once I got all that stuff together, it made me a much better leader, and it helped with my decision making. And it's what lets you choose how you behave
Yeah.
instead of behaving in a certain way and then justifying it by being a victim or hating someone and all the things that really happen. And
Yep.
the higher you go in leadership, the more power you have or the more fame you have, the more you have a moral obligation to deal with your shit. Because if you lose it, like you can really affect a lot of people in a very negative way, including yourself.
Yep. Totally agree. And so diving into that, so how was your childhood? Like, aside from this very, very early experience, like,
So
because,
I
yeah.
I lived in a basement that had toxic mold.
Oh, wow.
It was a nice basement in a decent neighborhood and all that, but that really also affects cognition. I had Asperger's syndrome,
Uh-huh.
Which is on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
So for normal people, when your nervous system is wiring itself, you look around and you see things and you sense things and
Yeah.
you just learn. For me, my brain wasn't making enough energy.
Uh-huh.
Like the cells in my body didn't make enough energy. So that means I'm running like a low power computer.
Yeah.
And then all of my nerves had static on them. So, for instance, I never learned to see my peripheral vision. I didn't know it was missing. How would I know? And I had to go through and retrain my eyes, retrain my hearing, and retrain my movement patterns because they didn't develop the way that they normally would. On the flip side, I learned to read at 18 months.
Wow.
You can teach your babies to do that. It's very bad neurologically because instead of moving, they just read. So I read more books than almost anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been, a blessing and a curse.
And 18 months, that seemed, again, I have a daughter, a 22-month-old daughter that I can't see teaching her to completely read. Like she kind of gets a little bit, but not fully taking a book.
I would fully take books and I would just read and read and read. And that means you don't focus on other things in the external environment.
Yeah.
My kids, by contrast, they're now teenagers. They went to a Waldorf school
Mm-hmm.
where they focused on emotional development and integration. And in that practice, you don't teach kids to read, or we'll say they don't learn to read till they're about 7.
Yeah.
And they learn to do it just naturally. And I was kind of losing my mind as a dad going, man, like this is a big bet. But I looked at all the other kids who'd learned to do it. And both kids just over the course of about 6 weeks when they're ready, it just dropped right in. And they're both top students at a top school without a lot of stress about it. I mean, they work hard, but there's like a sense of groundedness that I never had. So I think it was the right call. And academically, they're killing it. So I can't complain.
And so did you grow up being more of like, I guess, that bookworm that like, did that play out throughout when you were 5, 6, 7, 8? Like
I always read, but I was also angry.
Uh-huh.
I was also the biggest child in the class. Napoleon's complex is a real thing. So the smallest primates always want to attack the largest primate to show dominance.
Yeah.
Physics says that's a bad idea. So I got in a lot of fights. I dealt with a lot of bullying. I never threw a first punch. I might have said some things that earned the first punch, but I always threw the last one because I just remember one time, some very small guy in my class was trying to pick a fight. I just looked at him and I'm like, dude, if I put my hand on your chest, you can't touch me. Like, this is going to end well. I'm going to sit on you. Like, just don't.
Yeah.
He did anyway.
Yeah. How it goes. So a lot of fighting growing up. What were your interests, your hobbies? Like what drew you in?
I was a super nerd. This was back when most kids didn't have access to computers. My dad worked for a national laboratory.
Uh-huh.
And so I had one of the first personal computers ever made before the Mac even was invented. It was called a CPM machine for nerds. In fact, I still have one. They made 2,000 of those. The company that became Microsoft, like Bill Gates, made the machine that I used.
Nice.
And funny enough, when I was in the womb, my mom worked for Bill Gates and Paul Allen. She was the first employee of the company that became Microsoft. She was a half-time receptionist when she was pregnant with me. And one of the 3 founders of Microsoft bought my crib.
Wow.
All the weird things, right? She didn't get stock options, damn it.
So you were okay. So you grew up around that. And what did that manifest as? Were you programming? Were you creating software?
Yeah.
What were you doing?
I wrote video games and did all that stuff. At the time, the thing you wanted to do is be an aerospace engineer.
Yeah.
By the time I got to college, that industry was crashing. So I said, I'll study electrical engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And funny, I talked with my dad and I said, I want to study marketing. That seems really interesting. I'd been reading Entrepreneur magazine since I was 12. And
Mhm.
I remember saying, I want to be a venture capitalist because that seems like the most fun, like this idea of starting a business. I would read all the junk mail to understand what they were trying to do. I didn't care what they were trying to sell me. I was like, why are they sending this? Like, what's behind it all? Like, I was just always curious about everything. I still am curious, like maintaining a childlike curiosity. Like, why does it have to be that way?
Mhm.
Has served me very well. Although, if you look at the political system, you're like, it doesn't have to be that way. It's just dumb.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Touche.
You
No.
were asking more question. What else were you trying to get there?
Yeah. So no, you were actually on the right path. So you go to college. You were interested in entrepreneurship. Did you start studying marketing? Or
No, my dad said that's dumb. This is I come from a family. My grandparents met on the Manhattan Project. Grandmother has a
Wow.
PhD in nuclear engineering. Grandfather was a premier chemist who wrote. He actually co-designed the process we still use today for processing plutonium to purify it for reactors.
Wow.
So this deep nerd family,
Yeah.
right? So not studying engineering was like, not okay.
Yeah.
So I ended up studying computer science.
Okay.
And just for everyone listening, I left electrical engineering because I failed out of physics. And if I went to computer science, then I didn't have to take physics till my fourth year of college. And I was not a great student, not by a long shot. At the time, understanding Asperger's syndrome or ADHD or any of that stuff, no wonder. But at the same time, I was trying to pay my tuition. So I worked in summers, I put auto parts in boxes because it was the highest paid job I could get. And then I started a company selling t-shirts. And it turns out the first product ever sold over the internet was a t-shirt that says caffeine, my drug of choice. And it has this on it. That's the caffeine molecule right there. And I sold that before the browser was invented to 16 countries. And if I'd have been willing to take advice, I was too stubborn to do that. I could have just driven 80 miles to Silicon Valley and gotten funded. It's one of the things I always joke about. Mark Andreessen, a very well-known businessman, he wrote the Netscape browser. I actually wrote a review for a major magazine of his browser from college versus Netscape. And so we were in the same industry. I did the first e-commerce on the planet, according to the article from Entrepreneurial magazine about it from back in the day. But he was smart. He went to Silicon Valley and took on a mentor. And I'm like, I'll do it all by myself. Like, he's a multi-billionaire and I'm not. So kudos to Mark. And even during my tech career, which was really, really successful, I looked at actually acquiring Mark Andreessen's company as it was going up and as it was going back down in the position that I had. And so it's kind of funny. You look at what happens when you have enough curiosity and humility to ask for and receive help versus the I'll go it alone. And I just had the go it alone thing, which in retrospect, I didn't pick up that knowledge until a bit later in my career.
Seems like you've done okay too. Like
I'm not complaining.
Yeah.
I've done more than $1 billion in revenue
Yeah.
Across companies I've started, and it's changed millions of people's lives. And I just sit in gratitude. And I just wonder what would have happened if when I was 16 or 19, if I'd have had my brain working and I'd had my health and therefore been able to make better decisions, would I have figured out, hey, I could work with someone who's already solved all the problems?
Yeah.
Because that would have just been a gift, as it was in my mid to late 20s after I'd already made and lost $6 million. I did start hanging out with people 3 times my age who taught me the longevity field that became the biohacking movement. That when I started it, I just took the longevity knowledge and packaged it up so people of all ages could use it.
Yeah.
And so I did end up having enormously powerful spiritual mentors, health and medical mentors, and business mentors. It just took me an extra 10 years to figure that out.
Yeah, which I think everybody hits the timing at different times. I don't think waiting till your 30s too bad either. And so what did you do that made you $6 million? Let's get, we'll get to the losing it next, but how did you make that in your early 20s?
Well, I was this early adopter of the internet. And as I was finishing my degree, I ended up getting a degree in computer information systems with a concentration in artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
We called it decision support systems then because the university wouldn't allow you to say artificial intelligence because it would never be real. They literally said that. I'm just laughing.
Funny.
It's coming. And
yeah.
So I went to work. I really wanted to be a CIO, which is the worst job you could ever have. It's like dealing with everyone's problems.
Yep.
And so I went on to one of the first networking companies. After a year there, I started taking classes and then teaching at the University of California, I taught their web engineering program to working engineers in Silicon Valley. So I had about 1,500 students who were building Web 1.0, and I taught them architecture,
Yeah.
Which was the best place I could have ever been. And that helped me get this job at a company called Exodus Communications. Exodus invented the data center business. So even today, some of the bits that are carrying our conversation probably go through infrastructure that I helped to build.
Wow.
We built 42 of the first data centers in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And I co-founded a part of that company. Me and two other guys started the services division, which grew to $100 million a quarter in revenue. My stock options grew from 3,000 shares. We split 3 times in 1 year, and it grew to be worth $6 million.
Yep.
And I lost it because I got promoted so much that I was attending board meetings. I couldn't speak because I wasn't on the board, but I was allowed to watch. And I attended all of our leadership meetings. So I was blacked out because I knew all the inside information. I couldn't trade my shares when the company crashed.
Yeah, got it.
I lost it all.
Was that
but along the way,
that was the .com bust?
Yeah, .com bust.
Yeah.
The big lesson though is I thought like being famous would make me happy. And here it is. Even before I go to that company, I'm in Entrepreneur Magazine with my photo when I'm 22, 23, and like this kid's selling t-shirts over the internet or something or another. No one even knew what the internet was.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh wow, this feels good. And 10 minutes later, I'm like, this didn't change anything. I'm no happier. So then I'm like, money. And then and this was pre-Biden dollars. $6 million back then is the equivalent of $20 million today.
Yep.
Right. And I made that. And I remember really distinctly, I'm at this company, all of us made crazy amounts of money, just crazy.
Yeah.
And I looked at a friend and said, I'll be happy when I have $10 million. Like I can never be satisfied. Right. And the big learning there is that money and fame do not make happiness, not even a little bit.
Nope.
Right. And a lot of people believe that. And I kind of feel bad. I talk to so many people. I do a lot of mentoring. I actually run a mentoring group for high-end entrepreneurs with a couple other well-known guys called the Apollo Group. And in that crowd, it's not an issue because these are people who have $1 million plus businesses, and we're mentoring them on how to do this 100x thing. But when you talk to people who are teenagers or early 20s, quite often like, I just want to be an influencer. I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
Like it's the worst job.
Yeah.
In my case, I had deleted my identity. I'm a computer hacker. That's really my training. So you couldn't tell who owned my car. I was blessedly anonymous, and I gave it up in order to launch the biohacking movement. So, we're going to need a leader, and I'll do it. But it wasn't out of any desire to be famous.
Yeah.
It was just necessary to get things done.
Yep.
And, I'm happy I did it, but it is not what people think it is.
Yeah.
It's just a
lot. But having a face of a brand is always compelling. And so as you're building that. So how did you stumble into that? You have this crash, you move on from this company. And was it like, I've got to imagine the emotional roller coaster of that is significant. Again, you were at 6. We're like, oh, if I can just get to 10, and now, okay, you get to 0. Like, how was that piece?
It's traumatic. Yeah. In fact, the WHO has a list of like the top 10 most traumatic things, and like losing a fortune is one of them. Yeah. Not to say that I trust anything coming out of the WHO.
Touche. Yeah.
Clear, but at the time they might have had some credibility when they wrote that. They lost it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also believe that, getting married and doing what you're supposed to do makes you happy. I had an unsuccessful brief marriage in my 20s. And so I'm like, okay, now I'm getting divorced, and I've made and lost all the money. So I've tried fame. I've tried, having a relationship. I've tried having money. And during this time, I also decided I would get my MBA at Wharton. So I went to one of the top 3 business schools in the country, obviously the top above Harvard and Stanford, if you ask me, but those guys might say something else. But anyway, there's friendly competition there. And so getting an education, that'll do it. None of that stuff has anything to do with life satisfaction or happiness. Having enough money to eat and not worry is important, but beyond that. So I guess I tried all that stuff, and when none of it worked, I said, all right, I'm going to have to do some digging. Besides, I hit 300 pounds, and it's not like I wasn't exercising. I worked out 6 days a week, 90 minutes a day, religiously for 18 months, and I never lost a pound.
Wow.
I literally had the same 46-inch waist and weighed 200 pounds when I was done. I'm sure I had more muscle, but I could not lose the fat. So there's this interesting connection between the health of your body and the health of your brain. That's a big part of all this. But I just had tried everything and I'm just not happy. And when nothing worked, I said, all right, I give up. And a friend of mine said, you should go to this 10-day thing, like to deal with all that. And I'm like, what is it? So I'm not going to tell you what it is because you won't go. And so I finally just hit this point where I'm like, look, I've worked really hard. I just lost all this money. Like, I'm miserable. I had an unsuccessful marriage. Like, nothing works. So I went to a 10-day transpersonal and personal development workshop. We did holotropic breathing, IFS, internal family systems, a lot of stuff that I've helped to popularize in the biohacking movement. Mm-hmm. This is very, very progressive and early program. And I came out of that going, wow, the world's way more complex than I thought. There's way more of a signal coming out of my body than I gave it credit for. And I've got some learning to do. And since none of the medical stuff worked, 15 years of being on antibiotics, arthritis since I was 14, all the GI issues and the crippling brain fog, even was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. Like, that's it. I'm going to study this longevity stuff and find doctors who can help me. And I'm going to study with gurus. So I ended up deciding I'm going to go to spend 3 months in Asia and just go study with whoever I find. So I end up at a monastery in Nepal, doing a 10-day Vipassana-like meditation and learning a bunch of stuff, and get on a bus to Mount Kailash, which is the holiest mountain in the world. Meeting with monks at monasteries along the way, and just putting myself in a very different zone than I normally would have been comfortable with, and just saying there's got to be some wisdom here. And at this point, I've been just incredibly blessed to study with shamans and spiritual gurus and teachers from many different disciplines, which has formed a lot of what I do at 40 Years of Zen. This is my neuroscience program that's based on resetting your internal unconscious behaviors to the world. And so I just realized the world was way more complex than I thought it was. And it came from a mix of Western and Eastern understanding.
Got it. And so you get through that program, you discover a lot more about yourself. What was your next step? Was it doubling down and just doing more research? Again, it sounds like you're pretty broke at this point. So were you like, I got to go get a job? What was the situation?
I was pretty broke, but I had some savings. Okay. And so I actually decided after 3 months that I was going to come back, pack up my stuff, throw it in storage, and just go spend another 9 months traveling around Asia, because it was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And I got back to Silicon Valley, and then a friend says, why don't you come and be CEO of my company in Hawaii? I'm like, okay. And I think I'm going to do that. And before I could get there, another guy I worked with at the hosting company offered me a job that was just too good not to take. Yeah. And that was at a company that was acquired by Akamai for $600 million.
Got it.
And then I find myself later, sorry, that was a company. Which one was that? What order? Nope, I'm wrong. I came back. That company wasn't acquired by Akamai. That company was acquired by Citrix. Okay. And I ended up running, Citrix is a big publicly traded tech company. I ended up running virtualization strategy for that company for a couple of years. And then I went to the company that was acquired, I think. And it could have been.
Were those two big financial windfalls that made up for the loss? Or
surprisingly, no. And this was a pattern. Like, a lot of entrepreneurs have this. You have boom and bust cycles, right?
Totally.
So the company that was bought by Akamai, the CEO had promised a bunch of stock options, but didn't put it in writing. They didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then at another company there was, again, there were stock options, but they were issued at the wrong time. And that resulted in, instead of $800,000, something like $50,000 of upside. And I just remember going, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
Why do I keep? And even after that, I had another job at a publicly traded company, and I got the job when the company was at a very low stock price, and I did it on purpose, and I killed it right at that job. And then they had a layoff, and of course they laid me off because they didn't want to pay the stock at a low price. Yeah. Right. And again, that was another $800,000 not win, where you've earned it, but you don't get it.
Yeah.
And so this happens to a lot of entrepreneurs. And after a while, you realize, you got to really look at your contracts. And even my experience with Bulletproof was there, where if it's not in writing, don't do it. And you got to understand the role of venture capitalists and boards of directors, and they act like your friend. I sit on boards of directors, but bottom line is they're not responsible for you. They're
And
responsible
and they're your
for,
friend until they're not. Like at the end of the day, it's in business, and everyone's looking out for themselves. It's
yeah.
even if it's not malicious, it's still just the truth.
Oh yeah. And I mean, I've seen malicious stuff. I've
Yeah,
seen,
exactly. It can be malicious too, but even if it's not that, it's still if when the moment you are on the other side of the table from someone and you don't have that in writing.
when I talk about this with entrepreneurs, it's actually one of the reasons that I run the Apollo group with Naveen Jain, who's had 7
Yeah,
exits on
yeah,
Viome, and
known
with
to be well.
Vishen Lakhiani from Mind Valley. The
Mhm.
3 of us mentor people in part because I don't like to see entrepreneurs get kind of taken advantage of. And I, when I talk about this stuff publicly, so many very successful people, they'll just come up and say, same thing happened to me.
Yep.
So it's more common than you might know. And this is why one of the things that gives me the most pleasure is sitting on advisory boards. Like, you know what? That sounds like a good deal. It's not a good deal. And here's why.
Yeah.
Here's how to handle that conversation.
Yeah.
And understanding comes, I think, with time or with good mentorship. It's that with the government, every time you temporarily give them a right for your own safety, they're not giving it back, right? The role of governments is to accumulate power and never to give it back. That's why
Right.
the Patriot Act back in
Yeah.
2001. Yeah, sure, you're going to reverse that in a year. Yeah, I believe that,
Yeah.
right? Well, boards of directors are the same thing. So entrepreneurs give up rights for the common good, thinking we're on the same page. We're not.
Yeah.
You never give up a right.
Correct.
You just don't.
Yep.
And when the board says, but it's mutually beneficial, like, well, then are you going to pay me for that right? Let's put what you just said in writing. And then suddenly they don't want to do it anymore.
Right.
Right. I
Yep.
wonder why.
Yep. 100%. And so you took that job, you had a couple exits, didn't make the money. Like put me in, how old were you at this point? Like once you had the exit to Akamai?
Oh, I would have been like mid-30s.
Okay. So
So,
mid
so I'm
30s.
like, yeah, I'm living in Silicon Valley. I'm living in Palo Alto.
Yeah, you're making.
But
It sounds like you made a good
yeah,
salary. You've had a good run. You're probably a little annoyed. It sounds like at least a little bitter that like you've
but,
had on paper wealth that has gone away a few times. So
yep.
what's the next step? What happens?
Well, I had I met someone and we got married and
Uh-huh.
had kids. And I looked at this like, man, if I want to put 2 kids through like kindergarten and first grade at an average school, not the high end ones, it's going to cost $44,000 post tax per year.
Yep.
All of my friends with were in MBAs, they're dual income families living paycheck to paycheck.
Yep.
And I'm like, this is not sustainable.
Yep.
So I thought about it and said, I think I'm out. So I moved to Canada.
Nice.
And ended up buying a farm on Vancouver Island. Well, buying a place that we turned into a farm. So I built a regenerative farm.
Yep.
And I lived there. And I had a job for a couple of years in the world of tech, working for Trend Micro. I was VP of cloud security for one of the big security companies. I'm a computer hacker. And then I started what became Bulletproof. It was going to be a nonprofit blog. I just wanted to share, here's how to make your brain work. Here's how to be present. Here's how to lose the weight. Here's how to get your energy back. And I thought, well, maybe there'll be 10 other people who are interested in spending thousands of dollars on figuring out how to make clean coffee because I know that it's real. And it turns out there was more than 10 people interested.
Yeah.
So it just grew organically.
Yep.
When I started that, I did not have a lot of money. I just, lived on a single income in Palo Alto. I was working for a venture capital firm, but I didn't have a carry. I was an entrepreneur in residence.
Uh-huh.
So I just literally said, all right, let me see what I can do. And I surprisingly built a company that was up to $140 million a year in revenue, and I was running it.
Yeah.
Living on an island and traveling an unusual and crazy amount of time.
Yeah. How long did you run that for?
I started in 2011.
Okay.
And they fired me around 2019, I think.
Okay.
2020, something like that.
8-9 years.
7, yeah.
And so, as you said, there's something there that I think a lot of entrepreneurs miss too, which is you had something you didn't expect to have a high demand, and then that was just people loved it and it started to go. So you had this tailwind from the beginning versus headwind. Is that fair to say?
I don't know that entrepreneurs ever really have a tailwind unless you just get the government to give you a big bunch of money or
Sure.
something.
Fair.
What I did is, I studied longevity for, at the time, at least 10 years.
Uh-huh.
Right? And I'd done the work. And when I started sharing things, I also spent years on stage talking about boring things like antivirus software and cloud security architecture. Just like if you can get people excited about that in a keynote presentation, talking to people about you can live to 180 years old, you can lose your weight, you can increase your IQ, it's actually easy, especially when you actually know the mechanisms, you know how to do it. And when people try it, a week later, they come back and say, you just changed my life. Like I have never felt this way.
Yeah.
One of my investors, the guy I really valued when he was on the board as a venture capitalist, Dan, he never told me this. He just, on the day we announced my first $8 million of funding, he posted an article on Medium and he said, 60 days after meeting Dave, I had tried what he said. I thought he was insane. I've always been on a low fat diet. I put butter in my coffee. And he said, at the end of the day, I got in my BMW on Sand Hill Road. And before I went to drive home, I started crying. And number one, I'm like, venture capitalists don't cry. What is going on here? But he was being really vulnerable. And it was actually a heartfelt post. He said the reason was because he had crippling fatigue his entire life and he never told anyone and he would just hide it. And he was just so exhausted he could barely drive home. And this was the first day in his adult life he had energy all day long.
Wow.
And that's the kind of reason that I started the whole biohacking movement, was like, I want to show people how they can feel and what's possible. And it feels like, especially at the time when I started this, there was a lot of helplessness. I don't know. I just feel this way. My body just does this. My food doesn't matter. And I've run a circadian biology company for 10 years that makes glasses that stop jet lag. I'm really well known for wearing, yellow glasses, or it's called True Dark. It's a tiny little company I run, but like these things, I don't get jet lag when I wear this custom tint, and it's carefully designed. So like, I'm a computer hacker. Your body is a distributed system and it is hackable, and it's not medicine. And some doctors really are angry. What do you mean you can hack your health? Like, don't you know I have a white lab coat? I'm like, yeah, but you're fat. So, what you're telling me to do doesn't work on you either.
Right.
Right. And this isn't to shame people for being fat. Like I said, I was 300 pounds and I was willing to do anything. But what I did, the biggest mistake I made, is I believed that something would work. And so I did it endlessly, which is the definition of insanity.
Yeah.
And I made a commitment after that 18 months of working out. I sat down at a Carl's Jr. with my friends, and they're all thin. They're all eating twice as much as me, and none of them exercises. And I'm like, I'm just going to do what works, because this shit I'm doing doesn't work. So the very beginning of the biohacking movement was, let's do everything that might get you the result that matters to you. And then let's measure it. And if it doesn't work, let's do something else until you get it right. And that mindset was very disruptive. And today, Upgrade Labs is my franchise company. It's a biohacking center that uses AI to help you lose the weight or get the energy or extend your life. And it's based on all this biohacking knowledge. But at the very core, it's, where are you today biologically? What is most important to you? Most people don't even know. You want to be healthy? What does that mean? It's a different list for everyone. And it's too long of a list to actually chunk it out. It's sort of like, I want to be successful. Like, okay, what are the elements of success to you, and which one are we going to tackle first? You got to do the same for your health and your longevity. So we help people do that. And then we have all the tech that gets you there way faster, because spending 12 hours a week or 18 hours a week exercising, you could be with your kids. You could be building your community. You could be building your company. It's just, it doesn't get results. In fact, it's counterproductive for a lot of people, and it was for me. So I'm like, hey, let me start this. We have 28 locations opening right now. You go to ownandupgradelabs.com and be an entrepreneur within the franchise network. And this is a good way to get started for entrepreneurs, because it's one thing to say, I'm going to figure everything out. It's another thing to say, I have a run book and I have support when you're doing it. I just got back from our grand opening in Toronto, and that's our most successful opening, where the company broke all financial records, something that we expected to happen in 12 months. They did their first month.
Wow.
Because when you get your marketing right and you have something that is, you can feel that it works, things are different. Yep. And one of the things I learned at Wharton, we did a class where we proved it's cheaper to spend $1 to tell people you have a good product than it is to make a good product. Because if you make a good product, no one knows that it's a good product.
Yeah.
So I thought, that is just unethical.
Yeah.
So I'm going to make stuff that's better than anything out there. And I'm going to bet on people being smart enough to know the difference.
Yeah.
And they did. And that was the deal with Bulletproof. So it wasn't, that I'm this amazing marketer. I'm pretty good at marketing at this point, it's that I made stuff that people could feel.
Yeah.
And it really has been, it's changed the way we look at health on the planet. And I say on the planet, I sold 600,000 copies of my first book in Japan.
Wow.
There's millions of biohackers in Latin America,
Yeah.
Korea, China, all over Europe. This is a global movement, and analysts say that biohacking is a $63 billion industry. I started it.
Wow.
Right. And wow, that's how much humans were desperate for control over our own biology.
Yep.
Because how you feel is the most precious thing. And if you're low energy, you're probably not going to be happy.
Yep.
And if you have enough energy, then you can fix yourself or improve yourself or evolve yourself, whatever level you're at.
Yep. Totally agree. And so fast forwarding to what you were talking about, you got fired by the board out of Bulletproof. Like, what was that experience? Was it kind of like all over again? I have this thing and now it's getting taken away from me? Or?
It's traumatic for any entrepreneur. It happens a lot. I mean, it happened to Steve Jobs, right? It's surprisingly common. I know at least 20 entrepreneurs who've had that happen.
100%.
I probably wouldn't have minded if they had followed through and sold the company the way that they had explained they were planning to, but they waited several years, and the company exit was much, much smaller than it would have been when I was running things. Yeah. And so that was one of those things where there's a couple triggers that I see in so many humans today, not just entrepreneurs when they're going through my 40 years of Zen program, but just anytime you're dealing with trauma. And one of them is injustice.
Yeah.
Right. And so you're like, well, that's not fair. And it's not. But whether you're traumatized by that, it's like, do you believe life is fair? Because it's not.
Yeah.
Right. So learning how to not be reactive to that was a lot of work. Right.
Yeah.
And then the other one is betrayal. Mm-hmm. Right. And this oftentimes happens in relationships. You know, that person cheated on me, or, you know, how could they do that behind my back, or whatever the deal is. So I was definitely feeling those two things. And that can be like life destroying kind of energy if you're sitting in that victim mindset. I've also had employees steal money. I mean, almost all entrepreneurs deal with embezzlement of some type or another. And it's one of those things like, I trusted that person. Like, how do I trust anyone? And in the world of relationships, it's a major thing that stops you from having another good one. Yeah. Fortunately, one of the companies I built at 40 Years of Zen Company is around using neuroscience to put electrodes on your head and go into a very specific altered state that lets you let go of that. Right. So I did that. And I did that for all the stuff around Bulletproof. And I did it. I also got separated, consciously uncoupled in a very harmonious process about 3 years ago. And so for both of those, it took about an hour with electrodes on my head to go through and just become non-reactive to them. Uh-huh. Right. So you can accept what is instead of just internally roiling over that.
Yeah.
And teaching that process is something I just did. We had our 12th year of the Biohacking conference, the conference that started the whole movement. It's at biohackingconference.com. It was in Dallas. Last year will be in Austin in 2025. Mm-hmm. And we had 3,200 people there. Guys like Dr. Joe Dispenza's on stage, just this amazing thing. And I led the entire room through this reset process without the neuroscience that really helps. But just to understand, if you can be triggered, it means you're carrying a loaded gun. Right now in Texas, you're actually allowed to do that, but it's probably not a good idea to carry a gun that you don't know is loaded. And that's where most people are if you can be triggered. So if you can be triggered, it means that I can program you. So to create people who are just too energetic to be fooled because we have enough energy to think, that's a major motivator for what I do in lots of these things. And if you're running a business and you can be triggered, I promise you'll suffer greatly. Yeah. And you probably won't be as successful. And even if you are successful, your level of happiness, the company culture, they'll be gross.
Yep.
And if you don't learn how to identify and rapidly eliminate narcissists from your life, especially within your company, you'll also suffer greatly. So a lot of my learnings over the last 10 years have just been around looking more at what people do versus what they say. And just being a little bit more even keeled on things like that. I'm relatively known within my companies for being kind and generous and sitting in a state of gratitude. And part of that is when someone is, building an empire or undercutting other people or lying and things like that, I walk them out the door. And it doesn't hurt me to do that anymore. Firing people is never fun, but I'm like, I'm helping this person I'm firing because they're not happy. They need to go somewhere that's good. And I'm helping the team who's actually doing the work by showing them that I respect them enough to remove a person who's causing chaos in the organization. And I do not have a long wait time for that. In fact, I have a goal within the company that when we identify a new hire is running that operating system, within the first 90 days, they're gone. And the last one of those was under 6 weeks. So I used to be like, oh, we can fix it. I'm like, no, it's not your job. You have to fix yourself and then to support your team who's doing the work. And if they're evolving, that's great. But if in the course of their evolution, they're throwing the company off kilter.
Yeah. And honestly, there's just a difference between someone that's ramping up and getting to know how things work and someone that's like their character is off or something that it's just like, it's not a function of them training. It's about they're just the wrong person.
And there are a lot of people too, they're so desperate to please their manager that they'll lie. Oh yeah, it's done, but it hasn't been done yet. And I'll send it to you tomorrow. And then they go and they make it up that night. And when I was 24, I did that too, but it's not acceptable, right? I didn't do it. There was other things.
Right? 100%. So a couple more questions for you. Number one, what's next?
I have a new book that'll come out in 2025. It'll be my 9th book. That's about a lot of this consciousness stuff and some of the tools that help you just get there faster, because we're at a point in the world where meditating for 2 hours a day in a cave really isn't an option for most of us. And I know people who I greatly respect who are leaders in business who do meditate 2 hours a day. And that means it has to come from somewhere. Does it come from your sleep? Does it come from your exercise? Does it come from your kids? Right. And the return on investment on that is great. And if you can do the same thing in 10 minutes, it's awesome. So that's the book. I'm still doing the Human Upgrade podcast. We've got 1,200 episodes, almost 500 million downloads at this point.
Wow.
And I've interviewed multiple Nobel Prize winners. And my job is to find the people doing the work that people don't know about that's worthy, and then to shine a spotlight on them. So before we had a podcast, Andrew Huberman was on the Human Upgrade. Actually, Tim Ferriss was on before he had a podcast too.
He was on here before too.
You went?
He was on this podcast before.
Very cool. That's what I remember, because you guys have the same last name.
Exactly.
And then I had a bunch of other ones. Peter Attia, before he had a podcast, was on the show. Although Peter's not really a longevity doctor, since in his book he says you can't extend human life. I'm like, that's funny because we're already doing it.
That's interesting.
I'm impressed when you can charge entrepreneurs $250,000 to tell them they can't extend their life. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of money to tell you to take statins. But there's differing opinions and all that stuff. But I believe very much in the longevity movement. I'm aging at 73% the rate of normal. I've had likely more stem cells than anyone on the planet. I'm about to go get some inside my brain with focused ultrasound next week.
Wow.
It's called RMI. I've had gene therapy to extend my life. Usually that's about 9 years. At least it takes 9 years off your biological age. I've done that at Eterna with a technology called MiniCircle. And I spent $2 million on longevity therapies and longevity things. But it's $2 million over 20 years. You don't have to spend $2 million a year. Brian Johnson was on my main stage, and I like Brian, we're friends.
It's a good guy.
I just want people listening. You invest the dollars on longevity because it makes your brain work better now. You have a better life now. And maybe we're all full of shit and you're going to die at 82 or whatever. You'll just like your life better. But to say that's the goal is cutting it short. There are people listening to this who have the means to live decades and decades and decades longer than we think. It's happening right now. All you have to do is set it up right. And that's what I teach people to do. So that's Upgrade Labs, using AI and actually drawing people's labs. People can go right now, you can go to upgradehealth.com, and for about $800, we'll do your full longevity lab panel and use AI to help guide you on how to get to your goals faster, combining your wearables data and your lab testing. Like, the world is so interesting right now. So I'm all in on that stuff. I'm all in on the Apollo group, where Veen and Vishen and I are mentoring people. I'm an advisor, investor in dozens of startups. So I love being in advisory boards and just helping entrepreneurs. Well, how do you get to $100 million? Because there's only 17,000 companies that big in the whole country, and a lot of them are giant corporations. So what does it take? So being able to share that knowledge with someone so they don't make the mistakes I did, that makes me happy.
Yeah.
And then just doing more of the deep consciousness neuroscience work at 40 Years of Zen is a big focus for me as well. And on top of that, Danger Coffee is growing like crazy. This is my new coffee company.
Yeah.
It's mold free, and some of the companies I've worked with in the past don't say mold free on the label anymore. And it's not just mold free, but it's got a large therapeutic dose of trace minerals that can go into your cells. And no meditation or exercise works if you don't have minerals to power it. So it's called Danger Coffee because who knows what you might do, right? Like, and it's you might do the scary thing, like start a company, like ask that girl out, or whatever your thing is that just feels insurmountable. Get your energy up, and suddenly the mountains aren't that big anymore. So I specifically made that coffee for that reason, and people are loving it. So it's in my portfolio. I have several other companies as well, and that's what I'm doing. I'm just working on making things you can't buy, and then shining a spotlight on the people who are doing the work and attaining the knowledge that can change people's lives. And that's what I do on the podcast on the Human Upgrade. It's just curiosity and then sharing and curating. There's more than 120 vendors at the Biohacking conference. Mm-hmm. And when that happens in Austin next year, I mean, it feels like CES now. Yeah. And this was 100 people in a bar 12, 13 years ago. And it's amazing. So I spend my time on that. I have about 70 or 80 people across my portfolio in the companies, and doing all that and working on not being a workaholic. So
that's a good goal.
I have working hours, and I work with my assistant. Like, if you want to schedule something outside my 10 to 5 window, you got to ask me first, because that's my time. And of course, I make some calls during that time to catch up and all that. But there's thinking time, and there's also biohacking time every day.
Last question, kind of in the spirit of Apollo. If there was one thing you either did hear or wish you heard that helped you really like keep going, achieve success, what would be that one piece of advice?
Well, there's a time I was really struggling with this executive at Bulletproof who was actually running a narcissist pattern. And the thing about narcissists, they don't even know they're narcissists. Mm-hmm. Like, they believe their own bullshit. That's why they're very hard to spot. This was an executive who, while telling me and the board that she was losing $4 million over the course of the year, which was our plan, we're going to grow by 40% and lose $4 million. She actually lost $28 million. And at the end of November, she said it might be $5 million. And at the end of the year, she goes, oopsie. I'm like, you burned through 3 years of venture capital and lied to everyone about it? And so I didn't lie. I don't know where it went. And it was one of the most just crazy making experiences ever. So part of that journey, I sat down with my friend Ken at a conference, and Ken had been mentored by Jack Welch. And I told him what was going on, and he looks at me and he hands me his phone. He says, are we going to use my phone or your phone to fire her? And I said, well, like, we need this person. I can't really run the company without him. And he said, what would happen if a bus hit him? I said, well, we'd figure it out. He goes, then a bus hit him. That was some of the most amazing advice. I didn't take it, by the way, and it cost me probably $100 million personally. Yep. But it was the right advice. So that idea that if someone in your company, if you feel like you can't run the business without them, they are almost certainly running a pattern on you, a narcissist or a sociopath pattern, because you can live without anyone.
Yep.
And if it's really true that you can't run the company without them, you better get a number 2, because the bus might hit them.
Yeah.
Right? You don't know. So to date, anytime I felt like I cannot run the business without someone, it's always been a lie that I believe. And I believe it because of something they're doing consciously or unconsciously. And that's where you shine your attention. So that was the best advice. It was, should we use my phone or your phone to let that person go because they're out of integrity?
I love that. On the spot too. That's an impressive one to pull out. So thank you, Dave. This has been awesome. And thank you for coming on Hawke Talk.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.